again to the previous packaging. Now the great thing here is that every phone, no matter what color you get, has a black front bezel. So I think this works best with the edge-to-edge display or infinity display. Now the version I have here is Arctic Silver. Of course you can get this in a few other colors including black and orchid gray. Arctic Silver has this very distinctive mirror-like finish, and I really like this, especially with the way it works with the polished aluminum bezels. But of course if you want the sleekest look, definitely go for black. Now before we get to the big version of this, let's get to the accessories, and they're the same for both. So first up we have a packet that also contains a SIM or SD card ejection tool along the back. Inside we'll find lots of paperwork which might be specific to the carrier version you buy. At the bottom of the box you'll find a ton of accessories very neatly packaged, including some new ones we haven't seen with the GS series before. But the thing that stands out right away is that all of these accessories are black, a welcome change. So the first accessories we have is the USB-C adapter. So we have two styles here that you can use, and of course it's very handy to have, especially in a transitional period when many devices, including Samsung accessories, are still using micro USB. We also get Samsung's adaptive fast charging, which is also a standard spec built into USB-C here. So again, you can quickly recharge the internal battery on these phones. Lifting the cover, we'll find two additional accessories, including our black USB Type-C cable. But more interestingly here is the AKG headphones. So Samsung says that these sell independently for $100 and they come with your phone. Now the great thing here is that these are really high quality headphones and they sound fantastic. They do include an inline remote control and microphone, as well as replacement ear gels to find the right fit. In terms of the overall style, they look a lot like traditional in-ear style headphones, so nothing really remarkable here, but one of the great things is that we have a rope style cable, so it should be a bit more durable than standard headphones. So moving on to the GS8 Plus, again the only difference here is size. Everything else is otherwise identical, including the color I chose, Arctic Silver. Of course, all of the accessories are the same. The only difference is a spacer at the bottom of the box. Now, essentially, the design of these phones start with the displays. So we have two sizes here, 5.8 inch and 6.2 inch. Both of them have the same resolution, 1440 by 2960. That's also called a Quad HD Plus display, and that's because it's extra tall. So we have the same narrow grip thanks to the curved edges, but it's extra tall to fill up the space that was normally occupied by just blank bezel space. Now both of these phones have the same resolution, so the smaller phone gets a higher pixel count, 570 versus 529, but either way, they're really sharp displays. And once again, these are Super AMOLED displays, so that comes with stunningly bright colors and deep blacks. And this is also an extra bright display, so this looks fantastic outdoors. Even in direct sunlight, the display is clearly visible. Of course, a very legitimate concern is what happens when you grip the phone and touch the display, especially with rounded corners on both models, so you really can't get away from it now. Well, Samsung has really tweaked the performance of edge rejection. So when you grip the phone, it knows better. It knows not to act upon that grip as opposed to an intentional touch of the display. And for the most part, during my entire review period, it has been excellent. I've had no complaints. So they have improved the software enough to the point I think it's a non-issue. Now, if you pay close attention to the corners, you also see that the display is rounded to reflect the rounded edges of the phone, which looks really sharp. Now, like many other mobile devices this year, this phone also supports HDR. So with HDR, you can take advantage of the OLED display to its maximum potential with those bright, vivid colors and deep blacks. In terms of aspect ratio, this is 18.5 by 9, so that's actually a bit wider than the LG G6, so you have a few more pixels at the top and bottom. But of course, in terms of watching 16 by 9 video, this means you'll see black bars at either side, but Samsung does build in a software accommodation for video, so you can tap an icon that will allow the video to be expanded out to fill up the entire screen. Of course, this means you're cropping the top and bottom. Either way, I can comfortably say that this is the best looking display I've ever seen on a smartphone. Now, with this new design, the home button has been relocated to the screen, just like other Android phones. But unlike other Android phones, we actually get a physical click when you force press on the button. This is actually very similar to Touch ID with the taptic feedback you get when you press the button, which sort of replicates a physical click. And it does feel pretty similar to a button click, although it's not quite as localized as Touch ID. The only problem with this approach is that the fingerprint sensor is no longer on the front, it's on the back, right beside the camera, which is in a pretty inconvenient location, especially for the larger S8 Plus. Now, to get around the placement of the fingerprint sensor, we have two biometric sensors added to this phone. We have iris scanning, which we're familiar with from the Note 7, and face detection, which is a pretty old technology we've seen for a number of years, but Samsung seems to have perfected it. Now, face detection obviously is not as secure because you can use a picture to unlock your phone. Now, for me, face detection definitely didn't work as reliably, and there wasn't sufficient feedback to tell me what was going on when it was scanning my face, so I'd like to see them improve that. And after using this phone for about a week, I don't think there is any substitute for a properly located fingerprint scanner. It's just a lot faster and more reliable. Now, crammed at the top edge of this phone is a lot, including a much smaller earpiece, although it doesn't seem to affect audio quality. It sounds just as good or even better than the earpiece from the previous model, despite looking much smaller. But overall, you can see they probably shrunk the earpiece down to fit all of the sensors and cameras it needed at the top of the phone. So that includes an 8 megapixel front-facing camera with autofocusing. That's the first time I've seen that on a smartphone. We also have a secondary infrared camera for iris scanning and the infrared light on the other side. There's also an LED notification light, an ambient light sensor, and a proximity sensor. So again, a lot of stuff built into the top edge of this phone for such a thin bezel. The other big feature addition with this phone is Bixby, which actually gets its own dedicated button along the left side right below the volume controls. So this is not to be confused with a power button, which is still along the right side. Now, for the most part, Bixby is underdeveloped right now, but it's their alternative to Google Now or Google Assistant. It's a smart voice assistant, but currently the voice feature is not activated. We're going to take a look at that when we go through the software. Along the top edge, we'll find our combination nano SIM tray and micro SD card slot. Now, this is a waterproof device, so if you pull that tray out, you'll see that there's a seal around it to keep water out of the port. Along the bottom edge, for the first time on the Galaxy S series phone, is a USB-C connector. And this really opens up a lot of possibilities, which now includes a DeX dock, which allows you to turn this phone into a desktop computer. And that's thanks to USB-C, and we're going to take a look at that when I get that in for review. We also have a headphone jack, so that has remained, and we get another mono speaker, which is waterproof. This does sound better than the speaker from the last model, but it still has this weird robotic sound, especially with voices, but it is louder and clearer, and I definitely don't have as many complaints about this speaker as I did before, but it would be nice if this combined with the earpiece for a stereo speaker system like some other phones have done recently. A dual speaker setup would also solve the other problem here, which is that it's just really easy to accidentally cover up the speaker when you're handling the phone.
Samsung updated its with this tablet is that we're now down to a 9.7-inch model. The 8-inch is gone. We also have an S Pen included with the box and all the technology needed to make that work.
Speaking of water resistance, this is an IP68 certified phone, which means it's waterproof up to 1.5 meters at 30 minutes, so that's pretty impressive. Now, because we have this all-glass phone, we do have wireless charging built in, which once again supports fast charging in addition to both Qi charging standards and PowerMat. Now, when it comes to the spec sheet, it does get a little complicated just because there's different CPUs sold in different regions, but in the US and the versions I have here, we get the Snapdragon 835, which is combined with the Adreno 540 GPU. In other parts of the world, you might get the Exynos 8895 octa-core 10 nanometer processor, which is combined with the Mali G71 MP20 GPU. But either way, we get 4 gigs of RAM with 64 gigs of internal storage. So because we go from a quad-core to an octa-core CPU, we see big gains here in terms of multi-core performance. Single-core performance is up just slightly. We also get a nice jump in terms of our graphics performance. So when it comes to day-to-day performance, for the most part, Samsung has really done a good job optimizing its version of Android recently. And that really is the same story here with the GS8. It's smooth and reliable, and it really had no complaints in terms of speed. There are occasions when sometimes it looks like it's hanging up or freezing. A lot of that does clear up after a moment. I think it's doing some RAM management in the background to fix that. But for the most part, I really have no issue in terms of performance and no complaints overall. The GS8 is also the first phone to come with Bluetooth 5.0, and with Bluetooth 5.0, we have much better range and bandwidth. The range goes all the way up to 800 feet, which is more than enough to cover an entire property through walls and floors and more.